A desperate cry pierced the scorching Texas air. A newborn's wail beneath a gallows, where Dusthaven turned its back on innocence. Isabel Reyes, wrongly condemned, left her child wrapped in a tattered silver shawl, abandoned to the desert's mercy. Enter Ezekiel Crow, a weathered mountain man, haunted by a past of loss, stepping forward when an entire town chose silence. His single act of courage sparked a fire that could reshape a community or ignite its destruction. Will one man's defiance rewrite Dusthaven's fate? Share where you're tuning in from, hit subscribe, and stay with us to uncover how a baby's cry could change everything. What secrets lie in that silver shawl? Dusthaven, Texas, 1874. The noon sun scorched the cracked earth, turning the town square into a furnace where heat shimmered like a fever dream. A gallows loomed at the center, its shadow clawing across the dirt like a vulture's wing. Isabel Reyes, a young woman of Mexican and Comanche blood, dangled lifeless from the noose, her dark hair swaying in the dry wind. The townsfolk had branded her a horse thief, though whispers in the saloons told a different tale, a setup by men with grudges and greasy palms. The crowd, faces weathered as the boards beneath their boots, dispersed into the dust, their consciences as parched as the desert. Beneath the gallows, a faint cry cut through the wind's howl. Isabel's newborn, swaddled in a silver shawl frayed at the edges, writhed on the blistering ground. The infant's wails were sharp, desperate, like a coyote pup left to the elements. Sheriff John Harrow, his badge glinting dully, turned his back, spurs jingling as he strode toward the saloon. Amos Burke, the town's wealthiest merchant, stuffed his hands in his pockets, muttering about inventory to drown out the sound. Father Whitaker, clutching a worn Bible, quoted vague scripture about divine justice, his words a flimsy shield for the townsfolk's cowardice. 20 souls stood in that square, and not one bent to lift the child. Their silence was louder than the baby's screams, a collective verdict that this life, born of scandal, wasn't worth saving. From the edge of the square, where sagebrush tangled with shadow, a figure emerged. Ezekiel Crow, a mountain man carved from the Rockies' granite, moved with the slow purpose of a man who'd faced blizzards and bears alone. His buckskin coat, scarred from 6 winters in the wild, hung loose on his broad frame. Gray streaked his beard, and his eyes, sharp as flint, held a grief older than the hills. The townsfolk froze, their whispers dying as his boots crunched the dirt. Ezekiel was a legend in Dusthaven, half myth, half menace, a man who'd walked out of the mountains with stories no one dared ask for. Some said he'd killed, others that he'd saved, but all agreed he was no stranger to death. The baby's cries grew ragged, her tiny chest heaving against the heat. Ezekiel stopped, his shadow falling over her like a storm cloud. He knelt, dust coating his knees, and lifted the child with hands that could split logs, yet moved with a gentleness that silenced the square. The silver shawl, etched with faint patterns, caught the sun as he cradled her against his chest. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Shock, fear, judgment. 3 cowboys, reeking of whiskey and bravado, staggered forward. "Bury that criminal's spawn," one slurred, reaching for the child. Ezekiel's gaze snapped up, cold as a winter creek. His fist met the man's jaw with a crack, like breaking timber, sending him sprawling into the dust. The other 2 stumbled back, hands twitching near their holsters, but finding no courage to draw. "Anyone else?" Ezekiel's voice was low, gravelly, carrying the weight of a man who'd outlasted avalanches. The square went still, save for the wind and the baby's softening whimpers. He wrapped her in his coat, shielding her from the sun's wrath, and turned toward the town's edge. The crowd parted like sage before a gale, their eyes averted, shame burning hotter than the noon heat. Sheriff Harrow's hand rested on his revolver, but he didn't move. Amos Burke clutched his ledger tighter, as if numbers could absolve him. Father Whitaker's prayers faltered, his Bible a useless prop. Ezekiel's boots kicked up dust as he walked, the baby nestled against him. He didn't look back, but he felt the town's gaze, heavy as a loaded rifle. Dusthaven had chosen to let a child die rather than risk their fragile order. But Ezekiel had seen too much death. His wife's blood on a cabin floor, his daughter's screams fading in a raid, to let silence win again. This child, this tiny spark of life, was his chance to right a wrong etched into his soul. If this story's pulling you in, take a second to hit that subscribe button. It keeps these tales alive, and I'd love to know where you're listening from. Let's keep riding this trail together, because what happens next in Dusthaven will shake this town to its bones. As Ezekiel reached the outskirts, where the desert swallowed the road, he glanced at the child. Her eyes, dark and fierce like her mother's, met his. In that moment, he knew she wasn't just a burden. She was a reckoning. The desert stretched endlessly beyond Dusthaven, swallowing the road in a haze of heat and grit. Ezekiel Crow's boots crunched against the rocky trail as he carried the infant, her dark eyes glinting with a spark that defied the sun's cruelty. The town's judging stares faded behind him, replaced by the vast silence of the Texas wilderness, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling above. His destination was a narrow canyon where a chasm of red stone cradled his cabin, a weathered shack of pine logs and stubborn will, tucked against a cliff like a secret kept from the world. Inside, the air was cool, heavy with the scent of cedar and old leather. Ezekiel laid the baby on a rough-hewn table, her silver shawl catching the dim light filtering through a single window. The cabin was sparse: a cot, a blackened stove, a rack of pelts, and a rifle older than the scars on his hands. He stoked the stove, its faint glow casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls. The child's whimpers softened as he warmed a tin of goat's milk, scavenged from a trader's pack months ago. With a cloth dipped in the milk, he fed her, drop by careful drop, her tiny mouth working with a hunger that spoke of survival. Her eyes never left his face, as if she sensed the weight of the past he carried. Ezekiel's hands, steady as granite when skinning a deer or felling a tree, trembled now. Memories clawed at him. His wife, Mary, her hair tangled with blood after a raid on their mountain settlement. His daughter, Clara, no older than this child, lost to the same violence. Their village had watched, silent as bandits burned their world to ash, too afraid to act. That silence had carved a wound in Ezekiel deeper than any blade, one he'd carried through 6 winters alone in the Rockies. This baby, nameless but fierce, was a mirror to that loss, a chance to break the cycle of cowardice that had haunted him since. He wrapped her tighter in his coat, the hide still smelling of pine and earth, and sat by the stove. The canyon outside whispered with wind, carrying the faint howl of a distant coyote. Ezekiel's mind churned. Dusthaven wouldn't let this go. The town thrived on order, on lines drawn sharp between right and wrong, white and other. A child of mixed blood, born of a woman they'd hanged, was a threat to that order, a living rebuke to their justice. He knew men like Sheriff Harrow, whose badge was more about control than protection, and Amos Burke, whose wealth bought loyalty but not courage. They'd come for the child, not out of duty, but to bury their shame. As night fell, the canyon grew dark, the stars sharp as knife points above. Ezekiel lit a lantern, its glow illuminating the shawl's faint etchings, symbols he couldn't read, but felt held meaning beyond Dusthaven's grasp. He traced them with a calloused finger, wondering who Isabel Reyes had been beyond the town's accusations. A thief? or a woman caught in a game rigged against her. The baby stirred, her breath steady now, and Ezekiel vowed she'd live to tell her own story. A knock shattered the quiet. 3 sharp raps, like gunfire in the stillness. Ezekiel's hand went to the knife at his belt, his body tensing like a wolf sensing a trap. He eased the door open, revealing Sarah Holloway, the schoolteacher, her face pale but resolute under a wide-brimmed hat. Her dress was dust-streaked, her eyes red from tears she hadn't hidden. "I couldn't stay away," she said, voice low but firm. "I heard her cries, Ezekiel. I should have done more." Sarah stepped inside, her gaze locking on the baby. She'd taught Dusthaven's children for 3 years, her classroom a refuge for young minds in a town that valued conformity over curiosity. But she'd stood silent at the gallows, her fear of the town's judgment outweighing her heart. Now, her hands shook as she reached for the child, stopping short as if afraid to break her. "She needs a name," Sarah said, almost a whisper. Something to carry her forward. Ezekiel nodded, his throat tight. "Esperanza," he said, the word heavy with a promise he hadn't spoken since his daughter's death. "Hope." Sarah's eyes softened, and she repeated it, the name settling like rain on dry earth. The distant clatter of hooves broke their moment. Ezekiel doused the lantern, plunging the cabin into shadow. Through a crack in the shutter, he saw torchlight flickering down the canyon trail. Soldiers, their blue coats stark against the red stone. Sheriff Harrow rode at their head, his face grim, flanked by 6 cavalrymen from the nearby fort. Amos Burke's influence, no doubt, had summoned them, cloaking their fear in the guise of law. They'd come to restore order, to erase the child who threatened their fragile world. Sarah's breath caught. "They'll take her," she said, voice cracking. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "Not while I'm breathing." He strapped on his gun belt, the weight familiar as an old friend. The baby, Esperanza, stirred, her tiny hand gripping his finger. That grip, small but fierce, anchored him. He wouldn't let Dusthaven's silence claim another life. The soldiers halted outside, their horses snorting clouds of dust. Harrow's voice boomed, cold as iron. "Crow, hand over the child. She's a ward of the territory now." Ezekiel stepped onto the porch, Esperanza cradled in one arm, his rifle resting easily in the other. The torchlight carved his face into sharp angles, a man forged by loss but unyielding. "She's no one's ward," he said, each word deliberate. "She's got family now." Sarah joined him, her presence a quiet defiance. The soldiers shifted, hands on sabers, but their eyes betrayed uncertainty. Harrow's face twisted, caught between duty and the town's shame. The canyon held its breath, the standoff teetering on the edge of blood. If this tale's gripping your heart, hit that subscribe button to keep these stories coming. Tell us where you're listening from. Your support fuels this journey. What's in that silver shawl, and will Dusthaven's reckoning come? Stay with us to find out. Ezekiel's stance didn't waver, but his mind raced. The shawl's symbols gnawed at him. Something about them felt like a key, a truth Dusthaven had buried. Sarah's voice, steady now, cut through the tension. "Check the shawl, Sheriff. You might find more than you bargained for." Her words hung heavy, a challenge to the men who'd rather kill than face their own failures. The night tightened around them, the canyon's walls echoing with the weight of what was to come. The canyon's walls loomed like silent judges, their red stone glowing faintly under the flickering torchlight. Sarah's words hung in the air, sharp as a blade's edge. "Check the shawl, Sheriff. You might find more than you bargained for." Ezekiel stood firm on the porch, Esperanza cradled against his chest, her tiny breaths steady despite the tension coiling around them. Sheriff Harrow's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching near his revolver, but the soldiers behind him hesitated, their sabers glinting with uncertainty. The night was a powder keg, and Sarah's challenge was the spark threatening to ignite it. Heir dismounted, his boots kicking up dust that swirled like ghosts in the torchlight. He strode toward Ezekiel, stopping just short of the porch, his gaze fixed on the silver shawl draped over the baby. The fabric, worn thin by time, bore intricate etchings, swirling lines and symbols that seemed to hum with a story older than Dusthaven. "Hand it over," Heir growled, his voice low, but laced with the authority he clung to like a lifeline. Ezekiel didn't flinch. "You want it? You come take it," he said, his tone cold as a mountain stream, daring the sheriff to cross a line that would end in blood. Sarah stepped forward, her schoolteacher's poise masking a fire that had been kindled at the gallows. "Those markings," she said, pointing to the shawl, "are Vasquez clan symbols, old as the treaties that keep this town from being burned to ash." Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years deciphering texts, piecing together truths the town preferred to bury. The Vasquez clan, a powerful Mexican Comanche family, had forged a pact with Dusthaven's founders decades ago, a fragile truce that held raiders at bay in exchange for mutual respect. Breaking it by letting Isabel's child die would be a declaration of war, one that the town couldn't survive. Heir's face twitched, betraying a flicker of doubt. He knew the stories, raids that left settlements smoldering, families wiped out by the clan's vengeance. Amos Burke, lingering at the edge of the soldiers' ranks, shifted uneasily, his ledger useless against the weight of history. Father Whitaker, clutching his Bible, muttered a prayer, but his words faltered as Sarah's revelation sank in. The crowd of townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, gathered at the canyon's mouth, their faces a mix of fear and shame. They'd hanged Isabel to protect their order, but the shawl's truth threatened to unravel it all. Ezekiel's eyes flicked to Sarah, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. She'd been silent at the gallows, but now she stood tall, her voice cutting through the night like a whip. "Isabel was a Vasquez," Sarah continued, her words deliberate. "Her child carries their blood. Harm her, and you'll bring the clan's wrath down on Dusthaven. You know what they did to Red Creek when their kin were wronged." The mention of Red Creek, a town reduced to ashes 20 years prior, sent a shiver through the crowd. Even the soldiers, hardened by frontier patrols, exchanged uneasy glances. Heir reached for the shawl, but Ezekiel's hand shot out, gripping the sheriff's wrist with a force that made the man wince. "Touch her, and you'll answer to me before any clan," Ezekiel said, his voice a low rumble, like thunder rolling across the plains. The sheriff yanked his hand back, his authority crumbling under the mountain man's stare. Esperanza stirred, her tiny hand clutching the shawl as if she, too, understood the stakes. The standoff stretched taut, the canyon's silence broken only by the creak of saddles and the nervous snorts of horses. Then, from the crowd, Thomas the blacksmith stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow that dwarfed the soldiers. His hammer-scarred hands clenched, not with a weapon, but with a resolve forged in the fire of his own guilt. He'd stood silent at the gallows, his strength useless when it mattered most. Now, he planted himself beside Ezekiel, his voice deep as iron. "This child ain't yours to take, Heir. She's ours to protect." One by one, others joined. Martha Reed, Thomas's wife, who'd once shared bread with Isabel. Young Daniel, the stable boy, who'd seen her kindness when she slipped him an extra coin. Even Widow Crane, whose sharp tongue had once condemned Isabel, but now quivered with regret. The townsfolk formed a ragged line, a human wall between the soldiers and the cabin. Their defiance wasn't loud, but it was solid, like the roots of a mesquite tree gripping the desert floor. Heir's jaw tightened, his hand hovering over his gun. "You're defying territorial law," he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. The soldiers behind him shifted, their discipline fraying as they faced a town united not by fear, but by something stronger. Captain Elias Ward, the young officer leading the cavalry, stepped forward, his face etched with conflict. He was new to the frontier, his uniform still stiff, but his eyes held a story of their own. "I knew a woman like Isabel once," he said, almost to himself. "My mother. Saved by a stranger when our wagon broke down in Apache land. I won't repay that debt with blood." Ward's words hit like a gust through the canyon, loosening the tension. He lowered his saber, a signal to his men, who hesitated before following suit. Harrow's face reddened, but he was alone now, his authority eroded by a truth too big for his badge. The shawl's symbols, glowing faintly in the torchlight, seemed to mock him, a reminder of a pact Dusthaven had forgotten in its rush to judgment. If this story's stirring your soul, hit that subscribe button to keep these tales alive. Drop a comment with where you're listening from. It's your support that keeps this fire burning. What happens when a town faces its own reckoning? Stick around, because the truth in that shawl is about to change everything. Sarah knelt beside Ezekiel, her fingers tracing the shawl's markings. "These aren't just symbols," she said, her voice steady despite the soldier's presence. "They're a map, directions to Vasquez land, where Isabel's kin are waiting." Her discovery shifted the air, turning the shawl from a relic into a lifeline. Ezekiel's gaze hardened, realizing the child's survival meant more than defying Dusthaven. It meant delivering her to a family that could protect her from a world that would rather see her erased. Harrow backed away, his retreat a silent admission of defeat. "This ain't over," he muttered, mounting his horse. But the townsfolk's line held firm, their faces no longer shadowed by shame, but lit by a fragile hope. Captain Ward lingered, his eyes on Esperanza. "She's got her mother's fire," he said softly, then turned to his men. "We ride back to the fort. No report of this gets filed." His decision was a gamble, one that could cost him his commission, but it was rooted in a memory of mercy he couldn't betray. As the soldiers' hoofbeats faded into the night, the townsfolk remained, their breaths mingling with the canyon's whispers. Ezekiel looked at Sarah, then at Thomas, Martha, and the others who'd stepped forward. "She's got a name now," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Esperanza. And she's got us." The baby's eyes fluttered open, dark and piercing, as if she understood the weight of the moment. The shawl, now a symbol of defiance and truth, lay across her like a shield. Dusthaven stood at a crossroads. The Vasquez clan's shadow loomed large, but so did the town's newfound courage. Sarah's mind raced with plans. Teach the child, protect her heritage, keep the truce alive. Thomas flexed his hands, already imagining the cradle he'd build, strong enough to hold a legacy. The canyon, once a refuge for Ezekiel's solitude, now cradled a community's awakening. The night stretched on, but the darkness felt less heavy, pierced by the promise of a child who'd already survived the impossible. The promise of a child who'd survived the impossible lingered in the canyon air, a faint hope woven into the fading echoes of hoofbeats. Dawn broke over Dusthaven, painting the desert in hues of gold and blood red, as if the land itself bore witness to the town's awakening. Ezekiel Crow stood outside his cabin, Esperanza asleep in a sling against his chest, her silver shawl tucked close. The town below stirred uneasily, its people grappling with the weight of a night that had shifted their world. Sarah Holloway, Thomas the blacksmith, and the others who'd stood with him were no longer just neighbors. They were bound by a choice to protect a life when silence would have been easier. Years passed like dust storms, swift and transformative. Dusthaven, once a speck on the Texas frontier, grew into a beacon of change, its streets no longer choked by fear, but alive with voices in 3 tongues: English, Spanish, and Comanche. Esperanza Crow, named for hope, became the heart of this shift. By age 10, she was a whirlwind of a girl. Dark eyes, sharp as a hawk's, her laughter ringing through the town square where her mother had been condemned. She spoke with the cadence of the desert, weaving stories in Comanche, reciting lessons in English, and singing lullabies in Spanish that drew crowds to Sarah's schoolhouse. Her presence was a living rebuke to the town's old ways, a reminder that courage could rewrite even the darkest histories. Sarah Holloway's schoolhouse, once a cramped room of rote lessons, became a crucible of ideas. She crafted a curriculum that braided European knowledge with Comanche wisdom and Mexican traditions, teaching children to navigate a world where borders were more than lines on a map. Esperanza excelled, her mind quick as a jackrabbit, absorbing geometry alongside tracking techniques, Shakespeare beside oral histories of the Vasquez clan. Other mixed heritage children, once hidden in shame, began attending, drawn by a place where their blood wasn't a curse. Sarah's lessons, once confined to Dust Haven, spread through letters to other frontier towns, carried by traders who spoke of a school where difference was strength. Thomas Reed's blacksmith shop transformed into a gathering place, its anvil a heartbeat for the community. He forged tools that blended Comanche designs with European utility, axes with curved handles, knives etched with patterns from Esperanza's shawl. His work drew craftsmen from across Texas who left with more than iron. They carried stories of a town that had faced its sins and chosen redemption. Martha, his wife, organized communal meals where Comanche recipes mingled with Mexican spices and settler staples, the shared plates breaking barriers that words alone couldn't. Their forge, once a solitary place, now glowed with the warmth of connection, its sparks a symbol of Dust Haven's new fire. Sheriff Harrow, his badge tarnished by the night at the canyon, resigned within a year. His replacement, a former deputy named Caleb Ward, the young officer who'd lowered his saber, brought a new kind of law. Ward, shaped by his mother's rescue in Apache lands, favored mediation over arrests, drawing on Comanche councils to resolve disputes. His jail stayed empty, the cells gathering dust as he worked with elders from the Vasquez clan to keep the truce alive. The clan, wary but intrigued by Dust Haven's change, sent emissaries to trade, their presence a quiet acknowledgement that Esperanza's survival had honored their blood. Amos Burke, the merchant whose wealth once bought silence, found his ledger less comforting. He began stocking goods for all: Comanche beads, Mexican herbs, settler tools, his store a crossroads where barter outshone coin. His daughter, Eliza, learned Comanche from Esperanza, her nimble fingers crafting jewelry that sold faster than her father's flour. Burke's profits grew, but so did his understanding that value wasn't just in gold. It was in the trust he'd once dismissed. Father Whitaker, his sermons once cloaked in judgment, left Dust Haven in shame. His successor, Father Mateo, a Mexican priest with a weathered smile, spoke in 3 languages, weaving Catholic rites with Comanche prayers. His church became a sanctuary, where townsfolk prayed beside Vasquez's kin, their voices rising in a harmony that drowned out old divisions. Mateo's sermons, grounded in stories of forgiveness, drew pilgrims from across the territory, who left with seeds of change to plant in their own towns. Ezekiel Crow, now gray as the Rockies he'd once called home, remained Esperanza's anchor. He taught her to track, to read the desert signs, to wield a knife with the precision of a hawk's dive. His cabin, once a refuge for his grief, became her playground, its walls lined with pelts and stories. He spoke of her mother, Isabel, not as a victim, but as a woman of courage, whose love for a Vasquez warrior had defied a world bent on division. Ezekiel's past, once a chain, became a bridge, his lessons ensuring Esperanza knew her roots ran deep in two worlds. By her 18th birthday, Esperanza stood tall, her presence commanding as the canyon where she'd been saved. She mediated disputes between settlers and the Vasquez clan, her words diffusing tensions that once sparked blood. Territorial officials, once eager to crush Dusthaven's defiance, now consulted her, wary of her influence, but unable to deny her skill. She rode with the clan, learned their songs, and carried their trust back to Dusthaven, forging a peace that outlasted the treaties etched in her shawl. Dusthaven itself grew, its streets bustling with families from every corner of the frontier, Mexican, Comanche, Anglo, drawn by its reputation as a place where judgment bowed to character. The gallows, once a symbol of fear, was torn down, replaced by a market square where children played and traders haggled. The town's prosperity, rooted in cooperation, challenged the territorial policies that preached separation. Visitors came, skeptical but curious, leaving with tales of a community that thrived not despite its diversity, but because of it. Esperanza's life was a testament to the night Dusthaven chose courage over silence. She taught in Sarah's school, her voice carrying the wisdom of 3 cultures, inspiring students who'd inherit a world less rigid than their parents. Thomas built her a desk, its wood carved with the shawl's symbols, a quiet tribute to her mother. Caleb Ward, now sheriff, sought her counsel, his law shaped by her vision of justice. Even Amos Burke, once a pillar of greed, gifted her a ledger to track the clan's trade, a gesture of amends. As the sun set over Dusthaven, Esperanza stood at the canyon's edge, her shawl, now a cloak, fluttering in the wind. The town below glowed with lantern light, its people no longer strangers, but kin, bound by a choice made years ago. Ezekiel, older now, watched from his porch, his eyes tracing the girl who'd become his redemption. The desert stretched vast before them, but it no longer felt empty. Esperanza's laughter, her songs, her very existence were proof that a single act of defiance could ripple through time, turning a town of silence into a beacon of hope. The sun sets on Dusthaven's tale, where a child's cry and a mountain man's courage turned silence into hope. Esperanza's story shows us how one act can ripple through a community, forging bonds stronger than fear. What did this journey stir in you? Drop your thoughts below. Your voice keeps these stories alive. We're grateful for you riding this trail with us, sharing in the grit and heart of the frontier. Stay tuned for more tales that cut deep and lift high. Until next time, keep the fire burning and let us know where you're listening from. We'll meet again under the wide Texas sky.